Well, good morning, and welcome here to Lincoln Hall and to this hemispheric forum on reducing violence in Central America and citizen security and El Salvador's great experiment. And also welcome to this great place on the first day of spring. As of 7:02 this morning, it is now spring, and it certainly feels like it. This is, although yes, it is. It is also, by the way, the beginning of the Cherry Blossom Festival. Although they've made projections now that the cherry blossoms are now going to be at their peak from April 3rd to the 6th. So we're a little bit off here, but there's another anniversary that we're actually here to discuss. And we are about 10 days beyond the one-year anniversary of the truce in El Salvador. And as you know, in Central America is one of the most violent regions in the world. In fact, when you look at the levels of homicides per 100,000, in fact, Honduras is at the highest level of murders in the world at 86 per 100,000. And the rest of Central America with gangs, illicit trafficking, and drugs. And in particular, the success that Mexico has had in confronting the cartels, that has also pushed the violence into Central America. And within all of this, there have been lots of efforts to try and reduce that. But one of the most significant has been the truce, the gang truce in El Salvador. And when you look at what's happened in that last year, violence has decreased by about 40%. So what we're here to do today is really talk about the idea that, is this truce something that can be sustained? Is this something that can be applicable to other places? We'd like to know a lot more about it. So we are very fortunate with us today to have with us today Ambassador Altschul, who is the ambassador of El Salvador, and a very distinguished panel of experts to discuss this. And again, at this Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies Hemispheric Forum. This is something, we appreciate you coming today. This is something we do routinely to address topical issues, particularly on security and defense. But as our moderator for today, we have with us Professor Selena Realullo, who heads up our organized crime focus on our faculty, and will moderate and introduce our panel. Will you please join me in a warm welcome for Selena Realullo? Thank you.
Good morning, and I want to echo Dr. Downey's welcome to all of you who are here for a very timely discussion, actually, on, more importantly, how we think about reducing violence in Central America. As many of you know, Central America sits at the crossroads of North and South America, and sadly has been the victim of the downside of global supply chains in terms of drugs, arms, human trafficking, and the violence associated with them, those types of activities. What we've done today was actually we chose this date many months ago, hoping that the truce would keep up, and it's actually now it's its one-year anniversary. And also to highlight the different types of strategies and policies at the national level, but also at the regional level, that Central American countries have been engaged in. And what's more important to take a look at also is not just the government strategies that have a broad range, from mano dura to actually looking at how to think about prevention of engaging the youth, but also the roles of the private sector as well as civil society, including the church, as well as different NGOs. And today what we've done, and we'll have a program today, for those of you who need translation, para ustedes que necesitan escucharlo en español, es el canal 7. And we're actually live streaming this via the internet in English and in Spanish. So to all of those who are watching us across the World Wide Web, welcome as well. We're trying to leverage technology to be able to extend this dialogue and this debate on what the best strategy or set of strategies are to reduce violence in Central America. We will be actually beginning first and focusing on El Salvador's experiment. We'll have Ambassador Altschul speak on behalf of his government as to what has been actually executed in the past year, and also perspectives of the prospects for its endurance in the future in terms of the gang truce. And then Dr. Diana Negroponte from the Brookings Institution will continue with her long-term interest and study and expertise on the history of El Salvador. Then we'll take actually a 10-minute break and then resume the program looking at it more from a regional perspective. And we have Claire Silke is going to actually speak. She's actually at the Congressional Research Service. She is the expert on several of these issues, but has worked on many things that you probably have read in terms of reports on the situation of gang violence in Central America, as well as the Central American Regional Security Initiative. She'll be followed then by Eric Olson, who is the Associate Director of the Wilson Center's Latin America program, who has long steeped expertise in particularly what's happening in Mexico as well as the rest of Latin America regarding transnational organized crime and the institutional challenges that those organizations present to the countries of the region. And lastly, we'll have Stephen Dudley, who's actually spent a lot of time on the ground looking at a lot of these issues. And he'll be taking a look at not just El Salvador, but also he's recently back from Honduras, which, as we just mentioned, is sadly the murder capital of the world. And he'll be sharing with us his perspectives, taking a look at the role that violence is playing throughout the region. So I'd like to invite Ambassador Altschul to begin with us. The floor is yours, sir.
Well, thank you very much. First, I would like to thank NDU for this opportunity, and I would like to congratulate Dr. Downey for the excellent job he has done here for, I understand, 7 years? 9 years. So I'm sure everybody's going to miss you, Doctor. Well, I want to talk about, in general, about the situation, the security situation in El Salvador. And as probably you all know, one year ago, up to 1 year ago, El Salvador was one of the most violent countries in the world. This is nothing new. It started, the increase of violence started 10 years ago, and it was part the failure of the mano dura approach, the iron fist approach, which in spite of the efforts that were done with that strategy, the rate of homicides kept on increasing and increasing. Just to give you an idea, from 2002 to 2011, homicides increased from 2,024 to 4,372, so almost twofold in 10 years. By the end of 2011, we were having an average of 14 homicides per day, which gave a rate of around 60 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. This would put El Salvador, as I mentioned, as one of the most violent countries in the world. By the end of 2012, the situation had changed dramatically. The rate of homicides per 100,000 had decreased to 26, which is barely below the average in Latin America. And the rate of daily homicides had decreased from 14, as I mentioned, to 5.7 homicides per day. What has made this possible? Fundamentally, two things. One, which is not very talked about, but is the process that has been going on of strengthening of the National Civilian Police. There have been more than 2,000 officers have joined the police forces. 5,000 of them have been trained in this new concept of community policing. We're starting with the cooperation of the United States government with AID, pilot projects of model precincts, police precincts, which are already in place and are giving very good results. And there has been an improvement in the intelligence and the investigative capacities of the police. This has, of course, contributed to this improvement, but obviously the most important issue is, was referred to before, the famous truce. The truce between the two most important gangs, the Mara 13 and the Mara 18. This, as was said before, we're about to celebrate the first anniversary of this truce. And the results that I mentioned before are basically the result of this truce, because according to data that has been collected by intelligence apparatus in El Salvador, it is estimated that at least 80% of the homicides are gang-related. So this was the beginning of the strategy to say, well, if we want to, there's a war going on between the two gangs, and what we have to try to do is to stop this war. So this process of dialogue began with the mediation of the church. The military bishop, Monsignor Fabio Colindres, and a member of civilian society, started for probably 6 months before the agreement to talk with both gangs, until finally they reached a moment in which both gangs decided that they would stop killing each other. That was all. They said, we're not going to renounce to do extortions. We're not promising that we're going to stop all criminal activity, but we're going to stop this war between us. This was, as I said, a process that was mediated by the bishop, had the approval of the Catholic Church. Actually, the first press conference was done at the Nunciatura, at the Papal Nuncio's at the embassy. So this clearly provides that proof that the church has been backing this process. What was the role of the government? There was a lot of skepticism and speculation that the government was negotiating with gangs. That is not the case. What the government did was to facilitate the implementation of this dialogue and this process. By doing what? It allowed for the mediators to come to the maximum security prisons to talk with the leaders of the gangs, because that's the important thing. The leaders of the gangs are in prison and are still there, and they were in a maximum security prison. So first was to allow them to come in. Second was to allow for a transfer of the leaders of the Maras from the maximum security prison to another prison, where they would have more possibilities of communicating to the outside, to the gangs outside. This was done, even this was not a matter of negotiation, because they have already fulfilled a period of time by which they had to remain in a high security prison. They were transferred to these two other prisons where there were no cellular blockers, etc. They could receive visits, and mostly so that they could communicate with the gangs outside. Some basic rights that they had, according to the prison regulations, that had been denied to them were reestablished. Like, for example, the marital visit. They could receive visits from their children. TVs and radios were put in public areas. So this is what, let's say, what they have gained, if you want, from that. But this is nothing. Everything of this was within the legal framework. As I mentioned, what have been the results of this? To give you some data, from March to December of 2011, there were 3,697 homicides. In that same period, from March to December of 2012, once the truce was put in place, there were 1,761 homicides, a decrease of 52%. If we compare the whole year of 2012 with 2011, the homicides decreased in 41%. The level of extortions have decreased also in 11%. San Salvador, the capital city, went from being the second most dangerous city in the world, just after San Pedro Sula, to a present ranking of 44, which is even below of several U.S. cities like Oakland, Baltimore, New Orleans, to mention some. During this process, the gangs have voluntarily delivered or surrendered more than 400 weapons. We went through a period in which the Maras were extorting the buses, the public transportation system, putting fire on buses and even killing drivers. Since the truce has been on, there has been absolutely no incident like this anymore. And the schools, who were an area in which the gangs would recruit young kids, now have been declared by them out of bounds, some sort of no recruitment area. So these are the results, and as I said, there was a lot of skepticism. Many people believed that this was not going to last, and it was not easy. There was recently an article in a digital paper, El Faro, in-depth reporting on the experience of the first municipality that started this new process with the gangs. And it says at some point when the process was going on, fine, one of the gang members in that locality was killed. And this created a situation of tension. But one of the leaders of the local leaders said, you know, let's not kid ourselves. This is not going to be easy, but we have to stay the course. And that's what's happening. Now, what are the big challenges? I would at least mention two. One is what really the gangs are asking for is jobs. It's an opportunity to carry on a decent life. That is why they resort to extortions, because that's the only way that they can survive and support their families and so forth. So what they're saying is, if we can get jobs, then we don't need to be here. We're willing to take that change. So that is much easier said than done. Already in a very difficult situation, economic situation, in which even non-gang youth are having trouble finding jobs and finding better opportunities. This is not easy. But I think ultimately that is the most important challenge, and that is what can provide sustainability to the process. Jobs are important. They are not the only thing. Education opportunities, for example, for the gang members are important. Right now, they cannot go to the school systems. If they have tattoos and so forth, and the community knows that they are members of the gangs, they are not allowed to go into the school system. This is something that has to be changed, and they should have education opportunities and so forth. So that is a very important issue. And the other one, I would say, is to institutionalize this process. The process started, some people said it in an obscure way. The Minister of Security and Justice and Security was here recently, and what he was saying was, look, if I would have come out and asked openly to the people, do you believe that we should go through a process of a truce with the gangs? Obviously, we wouldn't have started, because people resent the gangs, no question about it. So how would they say, yeah, sure, let's start the process of dialogue? So it had to start in this way. This, of course, had the cost that it created, this appearance of something is going on behind. So it is important now to bring transparency and to institutionalize this process. Things are moving in that way. Recently, a humanitarian foundation, Fundación Humanitaria, was created, which incorporates members of the private sector, of the academic world, the government, and civil society to provide some sort of transparency and oversight over the process. This is very important. Another important thing that's going on is that the incorporation at the local level of the municipalities. This process called, it was originally referred to as sanctuary communities, which was not a good name because it gave the idea that you could commit any crime there and you wouldn't have any problem. No, the idea is to have municipalities without violence, in which the leaders, the local leaders of the gangs, come together with the mayor and agree to stop also the killing in that place. And this allows then for programs of social integration, rehabilitation, reinsertion, economic opportunities to start. In this community of Ilopango, which was one of the first municipalities that went into this program, you have one Mara has a bakery, and they are doing bread and baking goods to distribute in the community. Another one has a chicken coop, and they are working on that. At the same time, they continue to have meetings, and this process is the one that's already going on. Of course, if they do not commit any crime, the police doesn't have to come and intervene. So it is not that police is hands off. It's simply that if there are no crimes committed, then there's no reason. But what does it mean? That before, the police could come and arrest a gang member just because he was a member of the gang. If he had a tattoo or they knew he was a gang member, he could be captured. This is no longer happening, because if there is no crime, there should not be any capture. Other important element is that the involvement of international organizations, particularly the OAS, has been sort of following up and supporting the process, and also United Nations through UNDP is already also providing some assistance in this process. And the other thing that I think is important that would contribute to this is to improve the penitentiary system. The jails in El Salvador are overcrowded. People are living there in inhuman situation. So they become more, they say they become universities of crime instead of becoming centers of rehabilitation. So an aggressive program of prison reform has started. 3 new penitentiary farms are already in place for those who have the least level of dangerousness. And we're starting a process also of having the electronic bracelets for those who also have reached certain time. So this is another issue that we think will provide a sustainability also to this process. I would like to end with this and allow for any further questions. Thank you.
Dr. Downey, thank you very much for the invitation, and Dr. Realuyo, for you too for inviting me this morning to come and to really remember that this negotiation between the government and the gangs is reminiscent of a negotiation that I followed so very closely from the end of 1989 till its accomplishment of a peace in January of 1992, 13 years ago. And as I look at both situations, certain issues are coming out, and I'd ask if we could have the next slide, because these are the 6 issues that I am briefly going to touch on this morning. I want to place these negotiations in the context of what occurred 13 years ago. Ambassador, for this analyst, the greatest victory of your peace process was that you destroyed the old Salvadorian army and you recreated a new Salvadoran army which was subject to civilian control, which was also audited by human rights Commission, and whose number was reduced significantly. This plays a very important part in recognizing that the use of the armed forces in internal control is not something which up till recently the Salvadorian people have resisted. Thanks to the transformation of the Salvadoran armed forces, this is now an institution which is respected. And therefore, placing military checkpoints on the road from the airport into the capital, or from the capital to Santa Ana and to Ilopango, is not considered a threat or a source of fear. Now, a second institution which was reformed, if not the old one destroyed, was the civilian national police. And for those for whom Spanish is their language, will you please forgive me that at 5 o'clock last night I couldn't find my accent and my "ñ" function on my computer. Therefore, please forgive me that I have not put the appropriate Spanish accents on Nacional. The creation of a civilian national police was undertaken under the supervision of the United Nations and UNDP. An academy was created for the training of these police, which should be under civilian control. It would be a civilian police force. Let me combine this with number 3 there, and for my colleagues so they don't get cricks in their necks, may I share my PowerPoint? Only 6 slides, so it's not prolonged. In order to achieve a degree of parity between the guerrilla forces of the FMLN and the forces of the government, the agreement was as following. 30% of the positions in the police would go to the FMLN, 30% would go to the government or those who were linked to the armed forces, though not necessarily members, and 30% were open. Now, there was a great deal of competition for that extra 30%, with the FMLN undertaking great effort to ensure their sympathizers fulfilled this. What happened was that over time the police has become politicized. So when you have an arena government, they want to ensure that arena police chiefs are in a position of responsibility and vice versa. So there is this internal tension within the police at the moment. I will come and will raise to you why I have raised both the armed forces, its reduction and its respect, and the police, its civilian role, because in 2012, the ex-military man, who is very well known and respected here at the Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies, General Munguia Payés, is now the Chief of Minister for Justice and Public Security, and the head of the police is also a military man. In theory, that would contravene the peace agreements. And it is an issue as the effectiveness of the truce and the implications of the truce are discussed, I am sure, in El Salvador, but certainly here in the United States. This relates to a history in El Salvador of great military leaders. But some of those military leaders began as great men, greatly respected, and later abused their power. Whether we're talking about the dictatorship of the late 1920s, or whether we're talking about the period of the 1980s and the Civil War. That when El Salvador feels under threat, there is a sense of threat, external or internal. The people of El Salvador choose a strong man, and in this case I would argue that they have chosen a man well known here, General Munguia Payés. What we must hope is that General Munguia Payés accepts the limitations of the Constitution and accepts that he is now retired, and as a retired member of the civilian cabinet, exercises authority responsibly. An interesting phenomena repeating itself is that in 1992, as part of the peace process, those members of the armed forces who were forced to resign under the terms of the peace process were sent as military attachés to diplomatic posts overseas. And at present, in this political contest that exists within the police leadership, and within the police leadership, once again, we're seeing the dispatch of military colonels to diplomatic posts as military attachés overseas. There seems to be a pattern here. Now, I just want to move from the military and the police to the Supreme Court, because at the same time as the government is facilitating, Ambassador, I'm going to use your word, facilitating the truce, there is considerable upheaval within the political establishment of Salvador, with the appointment of a constitutional chamber within the Supreme Court, which has clashed frequently with the government, with President Funes, and with the legislature. This is part of democracy. We know only too well here in Washington how messy, if not dysfunctional, democracy can be. But it is a full-throttled dispute within El Salvador. And we must hope that the reforms implemented shortly after the peace process in 1992 recognize that the Supreme Court is an independent body. Let me now bring all of those 6 points to today's situation and the truce. And Ambassador, I'm sitting here rather uncomfortably on your right, but to tell you that I am a skeptic. I'm one of those skeptics of the peace, of the truce.
Understandably.
Let's have the next. I have covered much of these points already, but I would just say to you that the amnesty, point 4 down on this slide, is an issue which is still in discussion within El Salvador. I claim that in order to reach a peace agreement, it was necessary in March of 92 to introduce an amnesty in the legislature, and that amnesty permitted those on both sides, but principally on the Arena side, to be relieved of all criminal liability for the acts that they had carried out. This was in the model of Chile, but it is recently causing a degree of controversy within El Salvador, and maybe an underlying tone to the debate in El Salvador as to whether a retired military man should be the Minister for Justice and Public Security. There is this tension existing within Salvadorian society. Let's move to the next one very quickly. I've gone through really all of the points in here except the last. A police force, we know, must be trusted. If civilians trust their police, there is both a community and a sense of well-being. If that trust is abused through corruption or inefficacy, then the trust between citizens and their police force is broken, and it is very hard to re-establish. Now, this is not directly in point with the issue of the truce, but it is in point with the ongoing disappearance of citizens in El Salvador. Disappearances which could be attributed to several factors, one being the ongoing gang rivalry between the Mara Salvatrucha and the Barrio 18, as well as the smaller gangs, but also one that could be attributed to police authorities disappearing bad eggs in the community. And I would ask, Ambassador, that your Commission on Human Rights examine these claims of disappearance because they can damage the trust of civilians in their own police institutions. Moving to the next one, I think that I again have referred to this, that the commander of the armed forces is a very influential position in El Salvador, and we respect it. And I think over the last 10, 20 years, really, in the period after the peace talks, the commanders have both respected the Constitution, respected the peace agreements, and now act under civilian leadership in a limited function. They're also extremely effective when we're in the situation of hurricanes or earthquakes, which occur. I would remind you only that the U.S. used to play a rather heavy hand in our examination of the culprits of the murder of the Jesuits in November 1989. And I was concerned when, once again, two of our senators began to start their investigation of events in El Salvador concerned with the Supreme Court. And I would hope that we would respect the democratic process in El Salvador and not return to the days of U.S. congressional meddling. Let's come to the last one, the reformed Supreme Court, against, again, an issue that I have followed before, but one which I believe is very important for the legitimacy of Salvador's democratic institutions, the importance of its independence, and maintaining that independence, even if that means that there is a mighty public row carried out in all newspapers and clearly evident to all citizens, both of Salvador and to ourselves. You have many friends, Ambassador. Your country has many friends and many people in this room who have served or have followed events in El Salvador, and I think it's because of our real affection for El Salvador that we get worked up, that we investigate probably more than most foreigners do, but we do it in an interest of seeing the strength and the credibility of wonderful Salvadorian people. Thank you.
And then come back to actually take a look at a more regional approach to Central America. Thank you. We'll have a presentation by Claire Silke from the Congressional Research Service. Claire, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Downey. Thank you, CHDS. Thank you, Selena, so much for this invitation. I'm sorry to be standing, but, you know, at my young age, I'm having some back problems, so sitting is not good for me. So I'm going to stand, and hopefully that's okay with all of you all today. Today I've been asked to talk about CARSI, which is the cute acronym we have for the Central America Regional Security Initiative, and what's going on with U.S. assistance to Central America with CARSI, but also more broadly. And then I want to bring in a little bit, because I do cover El Salvador and U.S.-Salvadoran relations, I do want to focus a little bit on the role of U.S. assistance in El Salvador before I raise some general questions about CARSI at the end. The key points I want to get across today is that CARSI remains the primary funding vehicle for U.S. law enforcement and prevention assistance to the region, although some question whether it is a strategy for the region or whether it is more like a group of programs. CARSI is just one part of what the United States government is doing to address citizen security challenges in the region, and citizen security engagement has been increasingly coordinated across what DOD is doing, Department of Labor, DHS, ATF, all the different agencies, although a lot of improvement could still be made in that area. There also has been a great attempt and significant levels of donor coordination through bilateral and trilateral discussions, for example, between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico about how to help Central America, along with ongoing dialogues, albeit somewhat frustrating, with the Central American Integration System, CICA. Central America began sort of the U.S. assistance to Central America after being very high in the 1980s, went lower in the 1990s, much lower, and did not spike again really until we began to do some anti-gang work in the mid-2000s, and USAID began to do some prevention programs after they did an assessment in 2006 that there were that this was a growing problem that needed to be addressed. But U.S. Central America security partnerships did not begin again really until the Merida Initiative was announced in October 2007. Many people remember that the Merida Initiative primarily focused on U.S. assistance to Mexico, and that Central America seemed as if it was tacked on to the original Merida Initiative for Mexico without as much consultation with Central American leaders. Whereas Mexico received $1.1 billion in FY 2008 and 2009, Central America, which remember is 7 countries, was supposed to share $165 million. So it's $1.1 billion compared to $165 million. Now, Congress did make that assistance subject to human rights conditions. They call them withholding requirements, where 15% of the money that's given to security forces, both police and military, is conditioned on whether the State Department says that they're meeting certain human rights requirements. Excuse me. Congress also, in a positive light, earmarked money for certain things that they thought were important, such as judicial reform and anti-corruption efforts in Central America, an economic and social development fund that was to be run by the U.S. Agency for International Development, where prevention programs would be funded, and provided funding for CICIG, which is the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala. I think I got that right. As many of you know, the Merida Initiative in Central America was criticized by Central American leaders for its lack of funding for that region as compared to Mexico, and for the lack of consultations between U.S. leaders and Central American leaders. Merida Initiative in Central America did evolve, though, after 2 fiscal years to become its own entity known as CARSI. In 2010, the Congress separated out funding for Central America, and it became its own foreign aid program. The State Department came up with 5 pillars that were different than Merida's focus. Merida's focus at the beginning, if you remember, was largely on combating transnational crime, transnational criminal organizations, and drug trafficking, and hard side assistance to Mexico. Whereas the 5 pillars for the Central America Regional Security Initiative focused on creating safe streets for citizens, disrupting the movement of criminals and contraband, supporting the development of strong, capable, and accountable governments in Central America, establishing state presence and security in communities at risk, and fostering enhanced levels of coordination and cooperation among the nations of the region. So it's more of a citizen security focus than a transnational criminal organization focus, which is interesting. It also contained, as I said, 15% withholding requirements for all the countries for the first few years, but then beginning in 2012, Honduras is the only country who has the assistance is conditioned on human rights conditions. Okay. So what's kind of confusing is that when President Obama went down to El Salvador in March 2011 on his trip to Latin America, he announced another program or entity or initiative, which was sort of confusing, which many of you probably do not remember, known as the Central American Citizen Security Partnership. Now that has no cute little acronym like CARSI to remember it by, and it really hasn't been emphasized as much. There are fact sheets on the State Department website, though, where I did get this information. But really, the point of this is that President Obama wanted everyone to be aware of in Central America, and even in the United States, that what we do to support Central America is not limited to this one foreign aid program called CARSI. We have a lot of bilateral assistance going to the countries. We do a lot, maybe not enough, but we do devote about $10 billion a year to reducing domestic drug demand. We have a lot of FBI-run and ICE-run law enforcement efforts in the United States that go after transnational gangs, for example, and that is supposed to help the situation in Central America. We provide support through CARSI and bilateral aid. We cooperate between our law enforcement and Central American law enforcement. We have vetted units. Many of you guys know about the transnational anti-gang units run by the FBI. But the ICE has their own sensitive SIUs, TCIUs. They all are acronyms, but it's basically ICE has their own vetted units working in the region as well. And one big thing that DOD has had a huge role in, and the Coast Guard, and that I think you all are aware of, is Operation Martillo, which is an operation that began in January 2012, where European partners, Canadian partners, and partner countries in Central America, and the United States, Coast Guard, JIADF South, all kinds of agencies began working so that the drug trafficking and illicit commerce that was going on they call them the littoral waters, the waters right by Central America or through land, would be diverted away from the countries, and so the countries could actually have a chance to get the security inside their countries better, and that the violence might go down. I think that's what it was meant to do. If I'm wrong, you can correct me. $3 billion has been seized, and it's forced the transnational criminal organizations away from the coastal waters near Central America. Sequestration, as was said in the testimony of yesterday, Southern and Northern Command, sequestration could have a negative effect on this. The Navy has already said that they're going to have to pull back 2 boats that have been used in this operation, and so I'm not sure how long Martillo will keep going, but it's been very effective thus far. And finally, as part of what we do in Central America, a lot of you know about the group of Friends of Central America that was formed. It's a donor group that has countries as diverse as Norway and I think Israel and Japan, and all countries that give some funding to Central America have tried to coordinate their efforts better with what SICA and the countries of the region want for their security strategy. So that's another effort that the United States has been involved in. The point is that CARSI is just part of what we're doing in Central America, a lot of which I don't even know about. But we are going to find out, because there's going to be a GAO report out in September that nerds like me are eagerly awaiting, that's going to talk about all of the different efforts that the U.S. government is doing in Central America. If you compare CARSI and Merida, obviously the Merida initiative is much larger, $1.9 billion appropriated so far, and CARSI is much smaller, $500 million, close to $500 million appropriated thus far. But as you look, the request for Merida is coming down, and the request for CARSI is at least staying around $100 million or so, if not going up a little bit. Merida, enabled the creation of this very complicated security structure where there's people that meet monthly, there's people that meet quarterly, and there's senior cabinet level meetings every year on the Merida initiative. That hasn't occurred so much with Central America, although there is negotiations every time a memorandum of understanding is signed for a particular program, and that some countries have set up. Honduras has developed a bilateral CARSI task force with the United States, which has helped coordination in that country. MERIDA implementation has been faster than CARSI, partially because it's received more scrutiny from Congress, and partially because all of the stuff that Central America gets through CARSI has to go through Mexico City to be processed to get to Central America. So that slowed things down a bit. 1.1 billion has arrived in Mexico, and this is compared to 75 million that was dispersed to Central America through September 2011. Some of the delays in aid to Central America have also been due to holds placed on that assistance by Congress for various reasons and concerns. However, as what I did say from the beginning, is that MERIDA focused much more on hard side equipment, like almost $600 million for aerial assets alone, helicopter. I think there was 21 airplanes and helicopters provided to Mexico, whereas CARSI was just $28 million in foreign military financing, largely for maritime interdiction and communications equipment. So if you look, CARSI has been much more about training, prevention programs, community policing, vetted units, things that are not heavy on the hardware and heavy on the transnational crime focus. I wish I had this. There's one slide that I would have put up there that you all are probably curious about. The GAO report that's also on their website, they came out with a status of funds, and that's where I got that $75 million figure. But it also had a pretty graph that showed what the countries had gotten so far, which I do get asked by the embassies, who's gotten the most money from CARSI. And as of from 2008 to 2011, the largest percentage of the money, around $80 million, or about 23%, was regional aid, and the second largest recipient was Guatemala, which had gotten about $77 million in aid. A lot of that is because Guatemala had 4 helicopters provided by the State Department. That's very expensive to do, that are probably going to be passed on to the Guatemalan military. And then third was El Salvador, actually 17% of the aid, or about $58 million. So as of up to 2011, Honduras was actually the 4th largest recipient. When you think it's the most violent country, that doesn't necessarily jive with the funding figures. But I need to say that that in FY 2012, the State Department and the USAID informed Congress of their intent to allocate up to $72 million of 2012 money to Honduras. So once it gets all of that funding, it will be about 25% of the overall aid will be going to Honduras if you add in all the years. So the State Department and USAID did recognize that the threat in Honduras was so dire that more money needs to be going to Honduras. And also, El Salvador has received increased attention. I'm not sure how much more funding, but increased attention since it was named a Partnership for Growth country in 2011. Some of CARSI funds, according to a State Department person I talked to yesterday, have been going to support things that the two countries came up together with, such as a task force on crimes against small businesses and extortion, and crimes on public transit, which were 2 big priorities of the Salvadoran government. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. Overall, the State Department had not provided us, CRS, any disbursement data for CARSI since March 2011. There was very little data that we could put in our report. We just didn't know what was happening until the GAO January 2013 report, which came out and said that of what was appropriated between 2008 and 2011, $75 million had been dispersed, and $22 million in FMF, which is foreign military financing, had been committed. Now, that doesn't seem like a huge amount of money. It's about $97 million. But what's been spent is probably higher than that, because there's all these terminologies in funding, and the State Department may have provided a training that the contractor hasn't billed them for yet. So they've actually spent the money. It just hasn't been officially dispersed. So these things get really technical. But basically, the GAO report is very helpful if you haven't seen it. I feel like I'm working for the GAO today. But anyway, their new report that's due out in September 2013 is going to look at some questions that all of you may be wondering. How much CARSI funding have U.S. agencies allocated, obligated, and dispersed? And what activities did they support? And what were the results of those activities? And what non-CARSI assistance have U.S. agencies provided for partner countries that supports CARSI goals? And to what extent is there any coordination with the CARSI program? To what extent have U.S. agencies also factored in what other donors are doing, what the countries themselves can absorb, and what the private sector is doing. So it should be very interesting to look at when that comes out. El Salvador, I would say there's a lot of positives in the relationship with CARSI. El Salvador's always been sort of a regional base for several efforts that affect all the countries in Central America, such as the International Law Enforcement Academy, the Cooperative Security Location, which used to be called Forward Operating Location, where U.S. planes can do drug interdiction, which is based at their airport, and the Regional Gang Advisor, and some of the regional advisors are based in El Salvador and then go out to the other countries to do their work. USAID just announced that $2 million for municipal crime prevention proposals that were put forth by cities in El Salvador has been rewarded. And then they just announced the largest public-private partnership, I think, ever, where $20 million of USAID funding, which I think is through CARSI, is going to be matched by private groups in El Salvador to get a total of $42 million for programs for prevention in the country. I mentioned the Partnership for Growth, but I didn't really tell you all what it was. Does anyone know what the Partnership for Growth is? No? Okay. I didn't think so. Anyway, El Salvador is one of 4 countries in the world that was chosen by the Obama administration because it has good policies and it's trying really hard to boost economic growth, but growth in the country has not picked up. It's been very flat over the last 10 years or so. And so these 4 countries are getting intense cooperation and attention from the United States, where they've had binational teams identifying why aren't these countries growing, and then coming up with a joint plan, a joint 5-year action plan, which will go past this current administration, and committing each other to looking at, in El Salvador, the 2 barriers to growth they identified is obviously security, but the other is a lack of competitiveness in their tradable sector, which means like a lack of competition in their exports, I think, right? Yeah, okay. So there's no new funding attached to the Partnership for Growth, which is kind of hard for the countries who are selected. They're like, thank you, but we want the money, right? But it does mean that, El Salvador has received a lot of attention and donated equipment, donated services from U.S. agencies in terms of technical assistance in modernizing the airport and different things like that. And also some CARSI funding has been used to focus on things that have been prioritized as part of the Partnership for Growth. Like I said, there's been a lot of problems with extortion, and one of the things that they wanted was a task force that would look at how you combat crime on public transit and among small businesses. I would say, though, that there's been some tension caused by the U.S. Government's wariness about this is my own personal opinion and not where I work or anything, by U.S. government wariness about the truce when the Department of Treasury issued their designation, which said that the MS-13 was a transnational criminal organization, when they issued a travel warning in January, warning people not to go to El Salvador or to be careful when they go to El Salvador when the homicides had declined that year. And when U.S. officials have been very careful not to comment much, but saying that our programs that we are funding are based on prevention. They're not based to support any sort of program or necessarily the truce, but to support the Partnership for Growth. That's been the line that has been heard. I could be completely wrong, but anyway, in terms of Congress, and I'll finish real quick. I have no idea if I'm running way over, but Congress initially focused on the slow pace of deliveries. Where is the assistance? Why isn't it there? And they're probably still focused on that a little bit with Central America, which is why they've asked for the GAO report. But as CARSI implementation has somewhat accelerated and security conditions in Central America have worsened in some areas, and as Mexican transnational criminal organizations have moved in to the region, questions from legislators in the United States have broadened out to include, is CARSI really helping improve security conditions in Central America? Does CARSI have a solid strategy, or is it just a collection of programs that were just put together on a list? Is it being coordinated, and how could that coordination be improved? Should CARSI aid be increased or maybe redirected to countries that are demonstrating the political will and the budgetary resources to combat crime and improve citizen security? If they're increasing their fiscal, their tax, that they like, do they have a security tax that's going to support security programs? Are they increasing taxes on the wealthy or on private businesses to support prevention programs? How is the impact of CARSI being measured? How can success in a particular city be scaled up to reach the rest of the country? How are the successes of CARSI being communicated to the public? That's one thing that was not done in Mexico, and a lot of people didn't know what the U.S. was funding, and so there isn't whole lot of idea that Merida has had some success in Mexico. There hasn't been a real public relations strategy. Do any of the countries in Central America have that or not? How does CARSI complement bilateral programs and DoD efforts? And given the challenges that have occurred trying to coordinate regional projects through SICA or other entities, should most programs be bilateral or regional? Could other countries be doing more to help? Anyway, and now the big question, prospects on Capitol Hill for CARSI and other foreign aid programs is, of course, it's a difficult time right now because of the sequester and continuing resolution. And there's still bipartisan support, I would say, for CARSI on Capitol Hill and for Merida. In 2013, it was actually the House Appropriations Committee report that recommended $117.5 million for CARSI when the administration had only asked for $10 million less than that. So the House appropriators wanted to up the aid, whereas the Senate appropriators said no less than what was requested. So you saw bipartisan support for both Mexico and Central America, and I think it was Colombia too. Nevertheless, the sequester, they say, is going to likely result in cuts of about 5% or so from estimated appropriations in 2012, and regions that are not the number one, region of interest or region of threat maybe to the United States, they could have their assistance cut even more potentially. As a result, Congress may be increasingly concerned about the efficacy of U.S. and Central American efforts under CARSI. Thank you.
For a very comprehensive view of where the money is and where the money comes from. And I think you also did a preview of what Eric Olson's going to speak to right now, which is actually taking a look at that Mexican spillover because of the different strategies across the region.
Thank you. Word of appreciation and gratitude to Selena for organizing this event and inviting me to participate. She's been a colleague and a friend and a collaborator with the Wilson Center for some time, so it's always a pleasure to come back here and participate, and also to acknowledge Dr. Downey's long and industrial too, but an illustrious career at public service and your 9 years here. Thank you for that as well. You've done a magnificent job, and I hope I'm not embarrassing the ambassador, but also to acknowledge his tenure here as an ambassador. I first got to know Ambassador Alchus when he was working for the then mayor of San Salvador, the late Hector Silva, much beloved, and they were winning awards around the world for their work as a well-run, well-operated urban center in San Salvador. I remember being with Hector Silva in Paris one time when there was acknowledgments of this work, and the ambassador was part of that team, and his country is well served by his time here at the embassy in Washington, D.C., and I wish you all the best in the future as well. Thank you so much. Yes, I wanted to talk a little bit about the relationship between Mexico and Central America on this issue of crime and violence and organized crime. First, I thought I would try to just lay out very briefly sort of the conventional wisdom, if you will. The conventional wisdom says that Mexico's powerful and violent cartels have recently begun setting up shop in Central America, and that those violent cartels have moved there in large part because of the confrontation undertaken, the strategy undertaken, if you will, by President Felipe Calderón in Mexico, and pushed them out. And now they're in Central America, and that their presence in Central America is feeding this tremendous surge in violence that we've noted here today. Let me read just briefly from an article from someone, and I won't mention the author because the point isn't to signal him out, but his article is called "The Mexican Trickle-Down Effect." It says, there's little question that whether intended or not, Calderón's anti-drug offensive is causing the cartels to become much more active in places outside of Mexico, especially in Central America. He goes on to say there's ample evidence to back up such pessimistic assessments. El Salvador's murder rate, already one of the highest in the world, jumped another 37% in 2009. He's writing this in 2008. He even quotes El Salvador's then defense minister, David Munguia Paez, who is now the Minister of Public Security and Justice, who stated bluntly, quote, "The more pressure there is in Mexico, the more drug cartels will come to Central America looking for a safe haven." So you get this impression, this idea, the conventional wisdom that Calderón confronted cartels in Mexico, and in that confrontation, they fled to Central America, and that's feeding the violence there. Now, like all conventional wisdoms, there's a certain grain of truth. There's something there. I don't want to dismiss it all in any way, but I ask you all, us, to think together about whether this is in fact really what happened. And I would suggest that there are other components, other nuances, if you will, of what took place, is taking place now. First of all, we know that the Mexican organized crime groups have had a presence in Central America for quite some time. After all, El Chapo Guzman, one of the richest men in the world, the titular head of the greatest, largest, most powerful cartel in Mexico, the Sinaloa cartel, was captured in Guatemala in the 1990s and extradited to the United States. And in fact, Sinaloa has had a presence in Central America, networks there for quite some time that predate by a long time the recent upsurge in violence. The Zetas, who are reputed to be the most violent of cartels in Mexico with good reason, carrying out heinous crimes, beheadings, dismemberment, the whole thing, their presence is actually relatively recent. Certainly not before 2009 or 2008, because in fact they didn't exist as an independent cartel. In fact, I would argue that their recent arrival in Central America is more a function of the breakdown of their coalition with the Gulf cartel than it is the product of some attempt by Calderón to push them out. That role, that function traditionally that they had as the armed wing, the enforcers of the Gulf cartel, broke down in 2010, 2009 maybe, and that as they emerged and tried to play a role as a cartel of their own, an independent body, they reached out to other parts to develop their trafficking routes, not so much pushed out by the Mexican offensive. There's also recent evidence of their role, the Zetas in Central America. I don't know if you saw the report in the Russian media and in Central America of the breakup of a Zetas ring in Nicaragua. So it's a more recent phenomenon. The recent growth in violence that we've discussed, and I acknowledge absolutely the good news of decline in homicides in El Salvador, can maybe not be, is probably not attributable only or primarily to the presence of Mexicans, but other realities. What is driving this enormous violence in Mexico? And I think we have to look beyond sort of the conventional wisdom that somehow that's the product of Mexican cartel presence, and look at, one, where that violence is taking place. And admittedly, this is a generalization, but in general terms, the violence, the homicides, is an urban phenomenon, and the cartels concerned with trafficking are operating in coastal areas on highways and other areas, not necessarily where the violence is the highest and most acute. That probably, in all likelihood, is the result of local criminal groups engaged in extortion and kidnapping, in the retail market and selling of cocaine and marijuana. We know that the cartels moving cocaine from the Andes to the United States tend to pay communities in kind for the service of moving that cocaine, and those local communities then have to find a market to resell. And so they're reselling in San Pedro Sula and Tegucigalpa and the big urban areas, and that's where the violence seems to be most concentrated and the greatest. Not because the Zetas have moved into San Pedro Sula per se, but because this other phenomenon. Now, we also know that the Mexican cartels have for some time been seeking to increasingly control the whole business. First, as we know, they were simply distributors, receiving product from Colombians and distributing in the United States and receiving payment in time. But over time, and there's a lot of complex reasons for that, the Mexicans became more powerful actors and have slowly but consistently sought to gain control of the whole chain of trafficking, even into production. We know now that the Mexican cartels have been purchasing for some time product in Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela. They've had a presence there. We hear that the FARC is trying to divest itself from some of its drug assets as it maybe gets more serious about a peace process. And we know that the Mexicans are all too eager. I should say carefully, because my Mexican friends get mad. Not the Mexicans, but the cartels themselves have all too eagerly sought ways to purchase or take over those FARC drug assets. And so their role is expansive throughout the region. And one of the recent phenomena, we have a paper that's about to come out, is actually attempts by Colombian producers to try to circumvent these Mexican cartels by shipping cocaine to Africa and then directly into the United States to avoid this Mexican networks there. But their presence in Central America, while it may indirectly impact the violence, and I'm not trying to suggest that they're nonviolent actors, is, in my estimation, not the principal cause of the violence. People point to the massacre in the Petén in 2011, a horrific event, presumably between the Zetas and local criminal groups, but to me, that is more the exception than the rule, and that this transporting networks have sort of avoided engaging in the kind of urban warfare and violence that we've seen in El Salvador and in Honduras. What have been the government's responses to this? Unfortunately, in my estimation, they've focused too much on simply interdiction, mass mobilization, show of force tactics, and have lacked more of a strategic vision of how to approach this problem. More clearly differentiated strategies that look at the transnational aspects of it, of the local aspects, and at the gang aspects. And I think that's an important element. Also, what's been hugely problematic, and we've already talked about it here today, has been the failings of the criminal justice system in Mexico and throughout Central America. Police forces that in some ways have attempted to modernize, but a criminal justice system that has not modernized as well. And as we know, it's not enough simply to round up the usual suspects and throw them in jail, especially if those jails, as the ambassador mentioned, are tremendously overcrowded and become themselves universities for crime. We've seen in various occasions that mass arrests have done more to consolidate the criminal organizations than to dismantle them. So emphasis on the criminal justice aspects is absolutely necessary. But I would go beyond that and say that it's not enough. It's important. It's necessary to invest in institutions like the justice system and the police, but it's not sufficient to do it in a generalized way. It has to be done in a very specific way to address the specific problems of crime and violence in the region. Specific strategies to deal with urban violence and gang violence are as important and necessary as the more general approaches of institutional reform. We can invest, if I may for a minute, in reforming an education system at the national level. Everybody agrees better education is better across the board and something that needs to be done. But those sorts of reforms take a long time to take hold and have an impact. 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. Good things to do, we need to keep doing them. But there are also specific efforts, specific strategies designed to focus on educational needs of people, of young people in areas of specific risk that can be implemented in the short run and have an immediate impact. And so, in addition to favoring institutional reform, we need specific things to do. The deputy mayor of Los Angeles, in charge of gang-related issues in Los Angeles, makes the following point. In high-crime gang areas, we have, this is him speaking, determined that 85% of the children or kids in that area are not gang members. That means 15% are. But if you target your prevention to the 85% who are not and encourage them and strengthen their capacity and keep them from joining the ranks of the gangs, you accomplish a great deal. So that's the kind of focused program for youth at risk that I think is often missing in the context of the desire to bring about institutional reform. Now, let me just say a couple words about the gang truce, and I want to say up front, I'm not an expert on this. I think, well, obviously the ambassador knows a great deal about it, and my colleague here, Stephen, does as well. I think, in general, there's a perception that it's had indisputable results, good results. As the ambassador said, the homicide figures and the decline in homicides are unquestionably a good thing. The question becomes why and how come? And more importantly, what role the government played in making that possible and what role the government will play going forward. I find it a little bit curious that the way it's been described is the creation of a space. The state created a space and it provided facilitators, and it sort of emerged out of the discussion between the gangs. I'm not saying that's not true, but it puts the state in more of a passive role. And I think it's worrisome. Most gang truces in this country, and I won't say universally, but most gang truces in the United States that have been successful, the state has had a very specific role to play. Not a passive one, not allow people to talk, but a specific message and a specific role with specific threats for gang members who violate the truce. We don't have that dynamic, as far as I know, in El Salvador. There's more of a passive voice, if you will, coming from the government. And I worry about that because if things are good now, passivity doesn't guarantee they will be good going forward. And I think the state of El Salvador, the government, and the municipalities must play a more specific and direct role to meet the expectations of the gang members who are looking for jobs, who want alternatives to their lives of crime, and also, as I mentioned earlier, focused on at-risk youth who aren't today members of the gang but could potentially be down the road. Those are essential things if the process is going to be successful. And believe me, I dearly hope it is successful. So I have really more questions and concerns about the gang truce. I think it's unquestionably a good thing as far as it's gone, but let's hope it can continue on.
Thank you very much, Eric. Wonderful. Now I'll pass to our last presenter, Stephen Dudley, who spends quite a bit of time actually on the ground there and can share it with us, his recent perspectives from his recent travels throughout the region.
Thanks. Morning. Thank you, Selena. Thanks to the center. Professor, congratulations. Great career. Thanks to the other panelists, Mr. Ambassador. I run a small think tank called Insight Crime. We spend most of our time thinking about criminal groups. I'm also in the fortunate position to be a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center this year, which has given me some space to do some more thinking about this idea of criminal groups and how they operate. And I'm going to focus specifically this morning on these criminal groups, specifically the gangs. And I want to talk just to start out, just to say that the gang truce was for us and is amazing. I mean, it is super interesting. It is something that is historic, something that is where the government is taking a very big chance, I think, and many politicians are putting their careers on the line, literally, to push this thing forward. I think there are a lot of problems with this particular truce, but I think that there are also there's a lot to applaud, beginning with this incredible drop in homicide rates. So I think that is something to keep in mind. I'm going to talk about just to keep it simple, 5 things that I've learned about the gangs since the truce has begun. The first thing is that the gangs are responsible for more than half of the homicides in El Salvador. This sounds quite obvious now that we have a little bit more data. But before this experiment, we really didn't know. We really didn't have an idea. There were estimations that ran everywhere from, including, I believe the security minister himself said the other day, 11% of the murders were caused by gang members, all the way to above 50. Most of the academics fell between 20 and 30%. But we didn't know. This was, and the fact that the murder rate plummeted in such a rapid rate right after the truce was signed really told us something. It really gave us an idea of what was happening, where the homicides were coming from, and this has implications. It has implications not just for El Salvador, but also for other countries in the region like Honduras, as we try to figure out what is happening there. It has implications because we don't have any data. We don't know who the victims are. We don't know, where they're dying. We don't have any sort of empirical data that we can step back and really do thorough analysis and understand where and why and when people are dying in these countries at such enormous and historic rates. So the debate continues, and the debate is basically broken up into two big models. With one model, you might have kind of what you might call, and what colleagues of mine have called a layer cake. So you've got the layer cake theory where you have different things happening. At the top, you might have international drug trafficking, then you might have gang violence, and then you might have something else. But it's a cake. And there's another model which would be more like a spider web, sort of circles that are intertwined. So you have different factors and different things that are intertwined and causing all this incredible violence. Political vehicle, their own political party, and move in that direction. But the other model, which I think is much more likely, is that they will use their power and numbers and the space that they control in order to wield political influence, much more along the lines of a Jamaica. Think of the Shower Posse and the type of influence that they held with the Prime Minister of Jamaica. He needed them. He knows they need them. This is the type of influence I see the gangs moving towards in El Salvador. The fifth and final revelation, or that has come from this, and this has more to do with whether or not I think this is sustainable, is that the gangs know they need to ask for forgiveness from the Salvadoran people for what they have done. But they also want someone to ask them for forgiveness. This is a dichotomy that I think may spell the end of the process. Again, I return to my conversation with Viejolin. He says, "I will speak the truth. We are not proud of the kind of life that we have. I want this to be clear. We have made mistakes, whether directly or indirectly, by omission or commission or whatever. We know that every year of gang warfare, a lot of innocent people have died. We are aware of that. We are sorry for that. We cannot revive the dead, but let's be clear that within these dead are our family members, our brothers, our wives, etc. Children, parents disappeared, killed. We are aware of that, and we have asked for forgiveness publicly, and we have reiterated it on numerous occasions, And he takes a step back, and he says, one journalist not too long ago asked me recently, and do you think good people, having lost their families, their loved ones, are going to forgive you? Fine, I understand that, but I've lost family in this as well. And what does the most popular religion in America, Christianity, teach us? It says we have to all be forgiven, right? But if we are to be honest, and I cannot speak for the vast majority, but if we are to be honest, we cannot force people to forgive us, can we? And at that point, he laughed. We respect their decision. We have lost a lot of things, and that's fine. Someone can say he is not going to forgive us. But that is because he can't see beyond all this violence and can't see the structural reasons of why this problem began. This is a difficult thing to deal with. They see themselves in two different ways. They know that they're the victimizers, but they also think of themselves as victims. How are you going to reconcile these two things? I'm not sure we can. There's a lot of tension in El Salvador about this. And they're facing a massive challenge. If we look at the few polls that have been done, we know that over 50% of the population in El Salvador is against the gang truce. Most of them, the vast majority, do not trust the gangs. How are they going to integrate these players with the rest of society? This is the big question that Salvador faces. Thanks.
What an interesting panel of very different views, but most importantly, I think we've actually set the table for a very interesting debate as to which strategies might be better or perhaps should be improved when we look at, more importantly, I think, what Eric Olson underscored, there is no blanket solution. each community and each country faces a set of different reasons why there is violence that may or may not be related to illicit activities. But I think we've actually set the table for a wonderful Q&A session that will begin now. We'll ask you to those microphones, once I call you, if you could just identify yourself and your affiliation. And also, if you have a question in Spanish, we actually have interpretation to do that. Who would like to ask the first question? Yes. Microphone.
Thanks a lot. Yes, I'm the permanent observer of Italy to the Organization of American States. And I would like to ask actually two questions, two main questions. The first one is about the role of the OAS in the truce between the two main gangs in El Salvador. According to the Secretariat, the Secretary General of the OAS is guaranteeing the truce between the two main gangs in some areas of the countries, and then it's mostly to the efforts also of the OAS that things are progressing. That's their views, of course. I must say that personally, you know that Italy is the only EU country that really has been hugely affected by the organized crime in Europe. So we've been doing a lot of activities to contrast that phenomena, and we have lots of experience, and that's why we have also a plan in Central America that is specifically designed to train judges and police in the fight of organized crime, the sort of activities that Eric Olson was referring to. And I think, in this field, it's a technical field, but there are some laws also that need to be passed: protection of witnesses, sequestration of goods that belongs to gangs or mafia, etc. So all this is a difficult background. The protection also of businesses is something that has to be dealt with, because if the business is not protected, then they will be controlled by the gangs, by the organization locally, etc. So personally, I have a feeling that there is a real risk of evolution of the gangs towards becoming organized crime. I do not share totally the views of Mr. Dudley concerning the fact that gangs are not organized crime or are not halfway through becoming organized crime. In Italy, we've seen situations of gang fightings that stopped simply because these gangs transformed themselves into organized crime that would control the territory. So they would all know where to enact extortion, in which way, and then eventually control the territory. And when you go to education, that's also a fundamental factor. If you go to schools there and you ask the pupils, what do you want to become in some areas? What do you want to become when you're older? They'll answer you mafia boss. Why? Because the mafia gives jobs to my family. They give jobs to everybody. They're the ones, that help us lead a healthy life, and so on. So be careful, because I see really, the difference between. I don't see very much difference between what's going on there with the eradicating in the territory of the gangs and organized crime, frankly speaking. Thanks.
Thank you for your question. Perhaps,
sorry for being so long.
Ambassador Altschul, you'd like to speak about the role of the OAS, particularly in El Salvador.
Sure. I would say that the OAS has played a role at least twofold. One is by accompanying the process. I think having accepted to be the guarantor of the process is very risky, but at least accompanying the process, it has provided a legitimacy, if you will, and for people to understand that this is a window of opportunity. And I think that's very important. On the second hand, it is supporting with very concrete things. I mentioned before this humanitarian foundation that has been created. Before that, it was through the not the auspices, but the encouragement from the OAS that this humanitarian commission was created, which included the mediators, but included also other people from the civilian society. I think that has been one of the most important benefits. OAS has been insisting in this issue that I mentioned before. It is necessary to institutionalize this process and to provide more transparency to this process. And that, I think, has been one of the key things that the OAS has been doing. At the level of, and I don't know if symbolism is the best way, but the best word, but for example, the first surrendering of arms that the gangs members did was during a visit of Secretary General Insulza. So you know, I think it goes both ways.
Great. Another question. Yes, right here on the aisle.
My name's Cornelia Weiss. I'm a U.S. military member, and I'm also a 2011 graduate of the Inter-American Defense College. And my question is for Mr. Dudley. In reason number 5, you address the structural reason of why the problem began. And then in 4, you discuss inequality of the law. Inequality of the law, does that include why it began, or is it simply why it continues?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure where the inequality of the law came from in terms of political actors.
Right. You mentioned it in your number 4, and I didn't know what it addressed, so therefore I'm asking you what it does.
Well, the fourth thing that was illuminating was, for me anyway, in talking with these guys and in reading interviews with them, has been the way that they have adopted a political discourse. Now, granted, the intermediary between the security ministry and the gangs is a former guerrilla, so they have, along the way, adopted the rhetoric of an organization, of a political and social organization. Now, they also have longstanding ties with many groups that perhaps also have infused this notion of we were also the victims of these, of whatever it was. Was it a capitalist system? Was it a repressive police, etc.? So the sort of construction of a political identity for them, which is what number 4 was about. What sort of path will they take? What kind of political identity will they assume as this process goes along, I think is coming into vision. It's coming into sight. And as it comes into sight, we begin to sort of see where their political discourse is going to go. And it's going to go on the idea of we have been wronged by the capitalist system. There is a repressive police and military. We are the victims. And this is related to number 5. In the sense that they have this sort of double discourse that we understand that we have done some bad things, but we are also the victims. And I think that's the interesting thing that's playing out right now in real time in El Salvador that you won't necessarily get in other places where you're looking at gangs. Sort of what is their formation? What kind of form will they take as this thing progresses? I'm not sure I got to your question exactly, but there is, of course, a whole underlying institutional questions around, rule of law, et cetera, which I think is sort of beyond where I was trying to go.
Way in the back.
Hi, good morning. Amanda Sheldon with the International Organization for Migration. I actually have a question that's not about El Salvador, but about Central America, or Guatemala and Honduras. And that's sort of about replicability of this arrangement, not particularly a truce per se, but I've seen some other authors who have talked about that this arrangement couldn't be replicated in either Guatemala or Honduras. Are the prisons a chip that can be traded on? Is the hierarchy the same of the gangs? Are the gangs able to control their members the same way in those other countries as in El Salvador. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on, as we're talking about how this is going to evolve, what are the lessons learned, or what is the ability to use this to inform understanding this issue in these other places that have a very obviously strong gang presence?
Stephen, perhaps since you have a broader view.
I'm sorry, there's an echo in here. What is the question exactly? I mean,
if you can actually replicate what's happening in El Salvador, is actually, many of us have actually debated that there's a certain time and a certain context that it would be very difficult to replicate what's going on in El Salvador in Guatemala or in Honduras. And that was the question that she was asking.
I mean, I guess, I would almost defer to the Ambassador Stephen on this one, but I guess one thing you could say that El Salvador had going for it was that there were these two large gangs responsible for most of the gang activity, and so the actors, were relatively cohesive and had that capacity. It's quite a bit more diffuse, in my understanding, in Honduras and Guatemala. It's not just a matter of getting, two leaders of gangs together and letting them work it out. It's somewhat more complicated in these other contexts. So, I guess that would be one thing that would make it difficult to replicate. I think you could probably do it. The other thing that's interesting about the El Salvador thing is it has sort of a national character. And when we think about gang truces in the United States, they're very local, they're very community, they're very, at most, you're talking about a few neighborhoods in L.A. or a few neighborhoods in South Boston. What happened in El Salvador was really, much more extensive. It could also reflect the nature of these pandillas or maras or however you want to characterize it. So to the extent that you could go to a specific place in Honduras and Guatemala and identify two principal actors or possibly three principal actors and get them to sit down around the table and come to a solution, then I think it's replicable. But I don't have the sense, Stephen, correct me if I'm wrong, that there is that kind of pervasive sort of national actor amongst pandillas in Honduras or Guatemala. Or, Ambassador?
Well, but I agree very much what Stephen said. At least two things have made it possible for this. One is that they are much more vertically organized, the maras. I mean, there is a leadership. The leadership is in jail, but they control the gang on the street. That's why it was so important to facilitate the communication between the leaders of the Mara so that they could send their orders to the people in the street. So I don't know if that's the case with gangs in Honduras or Guatemala, but definitely in El Salvador, this vertical structure has played a good role in that sense. And the second is, also what Stephen said, the relationship between the Maras, the gangs, and organized crime. It is not a very strong relationship. There is obviously some local cliques or local gangs who do have contracts with the drug traffickers. If they go from El Caminito, Metapán, or whatever, obviously there are gangs who are providing free transit and probably giving protection. But that's at the local level. The Mara as a structure doesn't have, as far as we understand, direct links with narcos. And for example, I don't know if you read, but 2 days ago, this Salvadorian capo was captured in Guatemala. No? And he's a guy who operates from Panama to Costa Rica, to Nicaragua, to Honduras, to Guatemala. And he's not a gang member, he's a drug trafficker. And he has contacts, which are usually people who have farms, who have beach houses, et cetera. That's the way he operates. And there is no gangs involved in this operation. So I think that is very important. And again, I don't know what's the situation in Honduras or in Guatemala, if there's a more closer relationship between the gangs and the narcotraficantes. But in the case of El Salvador, I think that has been also a positive aspect in the sense that they have a little bit more, the gangs leaders have more autonomy in a sense.
We have time for one more question. I see a very eager hand on the very far right there.
Buenos días. Mi nombre es Scarlett Martínez, de Nicaragua, y vengo del Instituto de Estudios Estratégicos y Políticas Públicas. Mi pregunta es para el embajador. ¿Cómo se piensa materializar la política que el gobierno de El Salvador jugará para apoyar e involucrarse a la tregua de pandillas? Cuando el presidente Mauricio Funes y el ministro de Seguridad David Munguía Payés dijeron públicamente en enero que no se iba a realizar una ley de pandillas porque las propuestas de las maras se contraponían con los intereses del gobierno.
It is true. There was a law, anti-gang law, that was passed 2 years ago by the Assembly, which proscribed the gangs. I mean, it was a crime to be a member of a gang. This was sort of the end of the, mano dura type of policies. Now, it is being, the people are talking about the need to review the gang, the anti-gang law, in spite of what's going on. Because, as I mentioned before, in practice and the spirit of these communities without violence is that if there are no crimes committed by the gang members, then there is no justification, no reason to put them in jail. If they commit the crime, yes, the national police is going to intervene. But if there are no crimes committed, then they are not going to be put in jail just because they are or are suspect of being maras. So that is one thing. The other thing is what I mentioned before about the need to institutionalize more this process. And I agree with, I understand Eric's question or apprehensions. It is necessary that the government, as the government takes much more direct role in this process. Why hasn't it done it before? It's because it was believed, it was felt that you couldn't start this process in the open by consulting everybody. Do you think we should start the process of dialogue and with the gangs? Already right now, 55% of the people in El Salvador are against the truce. So imagine before. And it's understandable. These people have committed heinous crimes. So there is this rejection from society, which is understandable. But at the same time, the reason I think that more and more people are supporting the idea, or at least moving from total skepticism to let's give it a try, a benefit of the doubt, is because of the results. So you had to have a period in which you could come with results, because that is what people are going to respond to. Now, I think we are at that moment now. And now the key issue is, as I mentioned before, how do you get civilian society and other sectors involved in this? This is not an issue of the government. This is an issue of society as a whole. Private sector is fundamental in its role of providing job opportunities. Academics are fundamental. Other instances of civil society. And in this humanitarian foundation, the first time, the Minister of Justice and Security is part of the foundation. So, and I think there's other ideas in which the role of the government is going to become much more clear and defined. There's the other element, which is already moving on, and is providing resources to create these jobs in these communities. Last week, I think it was 71 million were allocated to do, in part, programs for development, for economic development in this community. So that's another fundamental area in which the state has to play a very clear role.
Thank you. Well, on behalf of Dr. Downey and the Center, I'd like to thank our panelists for a very timely and insightful discussion on reducing violence in Central America, taking a look at the experience of El Salvador. We do know that we group Central America as a unit, although we know that all the communities are very distinctive. And I think we can actually learn from more exchanges, such as the one that we've actually conducted this morning at the Hemispheric Forum. Thank you so much for coming.